What does it mean to have an American Pope? And what does it mean for American politics that this particular man, Pope Leo XIV, formerly known as Robert Francis Prevost from Chicago, is now the head of the Catholic Church? Joining me now to explain is editor-at-large for Commonweal magazine, Mollie Wilson O'Reilly. Mollie, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks. I'm thrilled to be here.
First of all, can I assume you're not a nice Jewish girl?
Yes, you definitely
Okay.
can.
Okay. All right. So I picked the right person to talk to here. So you wrote a piece for MSNBC.com that drew my attention. It had the headline, Pope Leo XIV speaks English. That's bad news for JD Vance. Explain why the language thing is so important.
They sort of asked me, like, what are your quick impressions and what's your and that was the first thing that really struck me. I should say that the election of this man took me by surprise, like it did almost everybody.
Yeah, sure.
So I was scrambling just to find out what should I know about him. And I had done that before. It was the same thing when Francis was elected. And the first thing I noticed was, oh, this is easy and also daunting because there's so much of him talking in English. I watched like a Q&A that he did last year at a parish in Illinois where he just was talking about his life and his work. And so the combination of he's so easy for me to understand, and also it's harder for me to say simple things about who he is and what he thinks because I feel responsible to take him very seriously as a normal guy and not the kind of weird otherworldly figure that we think of popes. So this guy's just a guy. Of course, they all are, but I'm struck by that.
Yeah. So why is it bad news for JD Vance? Like why I know writers don't write the headlines, but assuming you're okay with that headline, why is it bad news for JD Vance?
Yeah, I guess that was sort of a conclusion that I arrived at as I started to puzzle out what will it mean? And JD Vance came up because, of course, he famously tried to claim that what the administration is doing, I think specifically he was talking about cutting off foreign aid, ending U.S. aid and all of that, that was supported by Catholic teaching, in his sort of, I've been a Catholic for 5 years, and so everybody listen to me way saying that there's this theory and it's called Ordo Amoris. And I mean, it was obviously false to anybody who was listening. Obviously, no, the Catholic Church does not teach that it's okay to end your government's support for programs overseas that are largely, or in many cases, run by the Catholic Church because you're supposed to take care of your defense budget first. I mean, I don't. The argument was never even articulated to a point because it was so clearly nonsense. But he was confidently spouting this to the point where the Pope had to come in and but the way that the Pope did it was a letter addressed to the US bishops saying, here's some things I just want to clarify, and not mentioning JD Vance and not mentioning Trump because that's how popes work. So anyway, if we have Catholics on the national stage or in politics who are going to try to say that it's not only okay, but it's actually more right for me to be doing these violations of human rights around the globe because the Catholic Church says I should, then it makes me feel good, and I think should make someone like JD Vance feel concerned that the Pope himself can speak extremely clearly, can understand what's happening without anybody
Right.
explaining it to him, and can speak back to it if he wants to, without anybody getting in the middle and translating it back.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things you wrote in the piece was that you don't see Leo going out of his way to pick fights with Donald Trump or anyone else in American political leadership, which I'm sure is true. I mean, he's the Pope. But when he was a cardinal, Pope Leo did post, he did retweet some interesting things online, didn't he? Things that were not complimentary to the Trump
Mhm.
administration.
Yes, and that's encouraging to me because we do have he's so Prevost, Cardinal Prevost was, a bishop from America, but not an American bishop, right? He was a bishop in another country. So he didn't ever have to interact with Donald Trump or with the federal politics, national politics. But he did seem to, as a consumer of news, someone who read and shared things very much in the same line as Francis. So he was getting the information that Francis also apparently was getting, and maybe he was even the one who was saying, Holy Father, this weird thing is happening in America. You might want to weigh in on.
Right.
And I find that encouraging.
Yeah, definitely. I also, you wrote about this. Talk about why his choice of papal name might be significant. Who was the prior Pope Leo, Leo the 13th?
So Leo the 13th was the Pope from, I think, 1878 to 1903. It was a long papacy. And I think, interestingly, I don't know how relevant this is to what Leo the 14th is thinking, but that's the period of time in American history that Donald Trump is really obsessed with in
Yeah.
his sort of thick-headed way. That's when McKinley was the president and we had tariffs and everything was great, according to him. For Leo, it was the period when, the Industrial Revolution was producing this sort of oppressed class of workers. And so he is best remembered by most people for, he wrote an encyclical, a papal letter called Rerum Novarum, which was about the rights of workers. Primarily. And also it also has an impassioned argument against socialism. He goes out of his way to be like, I'm not saying socialism is right. In fact, it's very wrong, and here's why. But then he circles back to, these are the things that workers deserve, and these are the things that the owners of capital owe them. And he's very explicit about, I was just reading it, and it's written in a very like high Victorian style that's kind of entertaining. But he says things that are very hard to soften. Specifically, he says the hiring of labor and the conduct of trade are concentrated in the hands of comparatively few, so that a small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the teeming masses of the laboring poor a yoke little better than that of slavery itself. So it's really forceful.
Yeah.
And everybody that I was listening to said right away, like, oh, maybe he's trying to reference Rerum Novarum, because that was really the beginning of what's called Catholic social teaching, right? The church is applying the broad principles of Christianity to the conditions of the modern world. And indeed, he has said since then that he was, and that he's specifically thinking about the rise of AI and automated labor as a new kind of industrial revolution that presents new threats to the rights and dignity of workers that he wants to address.
Yeah, God, it's just so fascinating. Another thing about Pope Leo is that he is an Augustinian, a follower of the teachings of St. Augustine, and I believe he's the first member of this order to be elected pope. So what does it mean to be an Augustinian? There's a heavy emphasis on learning and knowledge, correct?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it's an order that I have not known a lot about. Most Americans, if they know it because of Villanova or Mary Mac,
Right.
or I think there are high schools and stuff too. In general, it's always been my opinion that religious order religious order priests make the best bishops, because their formation is not for service in a diocese and not for, climbing the ladder that way, but they have a global perspective on what the church is, and they've often worked in a lot of different places. So I was excited about that. It's pretty unusual to have a pope who comes out of that system. Francis came out of the Jesuits, and that was very unusual. And so now that
Right.
they've chosen another from a different order. But yes, they have a focus on mission. As a young priest, he was sent to Peru, and he spent most of his life there, learned Spanish, worked with the people, and eventually became a bishop. But they also have very serious about learning. That Leo the 13th was that way too. He opened the Vatican archives to researchers, and he opened the Vatican Observer. He made the Vatican a place of learning and study, and emphasized that the church should cooperate with science and modern learning. And they're also very devoted to the Blessed Mother. And we've heard in the few times he's spoken publicly, Pope Leo the 14th has talked. He quotes St. Augustine, and he talks about the Blessed Mother. He led the people in praying the Hail Mary. So I think we're going to be hearing a lot about that.
All of this is just absolutely fascinating to me. But one of the things that is sort of blowing my mind is that I keep seeing or reading interviews with Pope Leo's brothers. And for some reason, it just feels unreal to me to see like a chyron on TV that reads the Pope's brother.
Mhm.
Popes don't have brothers. I mean, except for brothers in Christ, obviously. Am I wrong to think this is wild, that when I picture a pope, I picture an old man who doesn't really have any family?
No, you're not at all. I'm absolutely the same. I can't get enough of the like
Yeah.
local TV interviews with his brothers. I think some of that is our perspective, and some of it really is true. So I remember, Benedict the 16th had a brother whose name was Georg, who was also a priest, and I used to think it was so cute that they would get together and like watch TV together. But they did both seem to live inside Vatican City.
Right.
They had been raised, it felt like, in that hothouse. Whereas seeing, and I'm trying to remember Pope Francis, like, did people in Argentina like know his family? I mean, I guess they did, and maybe we're just having the experience that those people had.
Right.
But it is, for me as an American Catholic, to see all of a sudden the kind of context that I grew up in be the background that the Pope grew up in. Like, here's a picture of him with his mom on Easter in front of his church. And like, oh, look,
Yeah.
that church has been closed and now it's just sitting and falling apart. And his brother was a Catholic school principal. It is absolutely wild. And it makes me think too, how the way that we run this system, the conclave, where they go in and then nobody can talk to anybody until they come out. He had no opportunity to call his brothers and be like, hey guys, just heads
Right.
up. It looks like it maybe is going my way. So they learned it at the same time as the rest of us. And then all of
Yeah.
a sudden there's 100 news trucks parked in front of their house. So they have no media training, no like opportunity to think about what does this mean. I'm watching his brother John, the one that's in Chicago, sort of
Yeah.
work out in real time. Like, oh, they said, well, when are you going to see him? And he was like, I don't know. I don't know how I should get in touch with him now. And
Right.
I guess they won't let him come here anymore and we'll have to go there. Like he was
Yeah.
at the same time as all the rest of us. And it just, yeah, it's really struck me because it's made me think about, that could be my family. What would that be like?
Yeah. And then over the weekend, we saw stories about the other brother, Lou Prevost, with headlines like, I'm going to read a headline from Mediaite. The Pope's Floridian brother shared a video calling Pelosi a drunk C word and scolding crying libs suffering from TDS, Trump derangement syndrome. Obviously, Lou is not the Pope, so we shouldn't attribute these thoughts to his brother. But do you think Lou is going to get a bit of a talking to about posting stuff like this going forward? Like, does he now have to sort of watch his social media?
I mean, probably. Yeah. I mean, it is so funny that the Pope's brothers are like, Facebook boomers, right? And they're just
Right,
seeing
right.
all the stuff that like my parents are. And it's striking to me, especially because we all of a sudden do not have the expectation in American politics that our politicians will be careful about the things they
Right.
say
Yeah.
or post or share. I was trying to explain to my kids. I have sons who are in middle school, and they were talking about the NFL draft, and I was trying to explain like it's not normal for the president to be posting about who he thinks should be
Right.
drafted. Like that's typically presidents are very careful about the things they say about especially stupid pop culture stuff because they don't want to be seen as intervening or
Yeah.
interfering. So the Pope certainly has always just the office is very, very careful. And so even when they want to directly criticize JD Vance, they're not going to say the name JD Vance. It reminds me of like Roger Clinton, like back in the day when it
Right.
was we
Right.
still
Or
thought,
Billy Carter for those of us who are ancient.
yeah, we still thought that like the president needed to be a certain kind of way, and now
Yeah.
it's the other way around almost. It's like, well, there are some members of the Trump family who aren't a disgrace.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I'm guessing that someone somewhere will sit down with the two Prevost brothers who are not priests and maybe talk to them about
Yeah, I would think.
their public facing persona going forward.
Yeah, exactly. So, on a more serious note, is there any sense in which the election of an American pope is sort of maybe a shot across the bow at American evangelicals, who I think it's fair to say have been gaining in power during the Trump era? Or is this a total reach and just some weird thought that I had that is like, no, that's not how it works?
I don't know. I think that the Catholic Church as an institution is more concerned about losing the sort of active participation of its membership than it is
Uh-huh.
about. But on the other hand, I think especially Latino Catholics, I think do tend to drift evangelical in the United States. So I don't know if they're directly concerned about that. I think they do worry in a very broad sense about I think the Cardinals worry in a broad sense about how do we retain our membership? How do we re-energize our membership? That when it comes to evangelism in the 21st century, what that means for Catholicism is encouraging people who are nominally Catholic to be actively Catholic, much more than it means reaching out to people who aren't Catholic and trying to bring them in.
Okay, yeah, I was thinking also, but just from a sort of, not to be crass about it, but just from a political standpoint, like from a
Mhm.
standpoint of political power. Like I said, I think it's definitely fair to say that evangelicals have found themselves in a very good place with Trump. And so I wonder what you think about the idea that, while when the Cardinals are sequestered in conclave, that does any of this enter their mind? Or again, am I just reaching for things because this is a political podcast, so I want to make everything about politics?
I think if the Cardinals are thinking about American politics, I would imagine that they're thinking about it more in the sense that America right now poses a real threat to the rest of the world. But it's definitely true that evangelicals are powerful in politics right now, and also that a lot of prominent political Catholics are in an alliance with that sort of
Right.
evangelical movement. So I do think, I mean, there are definitely a few American cardinals who I think would be keeping that context in mind in their vote. So to sort of name names, Cardinal Prevost, before he became the Pope, his job was the head of the Dicastery of Bishops, and that's the office that elevates men to be bishops, that chooses who to send where, and sometimes has to fire them too. And he'd only been doing that for a couple of years, but he had made some major moves in the US. And most recently, he moved Cardinal McElroy to Washington, D.C. And that was, people made a lot of hay out of that because he's considered pretty liberal.
Mhm.
Definitely not a guy who's going to pose in photos with Trump. He's very intelligent, I think, and understands the kind of shrewdness that's necessary to be a faith leader. And when Donald Trump wants to just say that they belong to him and they're on his side. So I think Prevost was probably very involved in saying this is the guy to put in this situation at this moment. And in turn, I think McElroy and a few other of the Americans sitting in that room were thinking about that same thing. I don't know if the rest of the world is as tuned in to
Right.
the way that Christianity functions in the United States politically.
Yeah, that's what I'm always wondering. Like, obviously, I'm going to see things through an American lens, and that's no pun intended. That's a little parochial, I guess, in this case. What do you make of the negative reaction to Pope Leo by a lot of conservatives? We've seen, derisively calling him the woke pope and stuff like that.
The conservative doesn't even feel like the right word anymore, but the
True.
right-wing Catholic
Yeah.
group. I think the first thing to know about these very vocal right-wing Catholic groups is that, like right-wing political people, they're weird. They're weird,
Right.
and
Right.
they have a very weird attitude toward what Catholicism is and looks like and should be. But under, I think, John Paul II and then Benedict XVI, they felt very comfortable that, like, but we're the right kind of Catholic. We're the real kind of Catholic, and we'll always be the favorite, the favorite child. And then Francis was a real shock to the system for them. And they didn't respond by saying we need to be good Catholics by trying to make peace with this pope. They responded by saying we reject this pope, basically.
Right.
So I think a lot of them hoped that finally they were going to get somebody who made them feel like they were at the front of the line again, and they didn't get it. But Leo XIV is not any kind of like a culture warrior. That's
Yeah.
what's funny. The way they characterize, he slams Trump and he does and it's not at all. He seems very careful and very gentle. And at a certain point, if you're going to choose to be in an adversarial relationship with a pope like this, it's because that's what you want. That's the kind of Catholicism, the kind of experience of religion that you want.
Right. So you're saying we're not going to see a bunch of transgender cardinals under Leo's watch? He's not quite that woke.
And no, it's such a weird feeling to be on the progressive Catholic side of things and watch conservatives losing their mind as though we were getting everything we want, as though the
Yeah.
church had
Yeah.
completely, embraced LGBTQ people and women were
Right.
priests now. When we're sitting over here saying, like, I wish, like, where is this pope that you keep talking about? Because that's not the guy that I've been seeing, and I don't think we're going to see it in the future either.
Yeah. Molly, thank you so much. As I think I said maybe 24 times during this is also fascinating to me. And I'm so glad I had the opportunity to talk to you about it. Thanks again.
Of course, thanks so much.